Sonic Frontiers is a really good game. Despite it having glaring issues, it's still held together by the fact that running around an open world as Sonic is inherently fun. I'm sure you've heard that a million times, but it does bring into question one thing. What is the future of Sonic in the open zone? Sonic Frontiers is already over 2 years old when I'm making this video, so I think it's time to start thinking about the future of Sonic in the open zone. So today, I want to talk about all of the main aspects of Sonic Frontiers, kind of give some of my criticisms, some of the things I liked, and what I think is the potential of an open zone Sonic game. Frontiers' gameplay loop can kind of be broken into 3 different aspects. You have the combat, you have the open zone exploration, so platforming, puzzles, all of that, and the linear levels, which in Frontiers was obviously Cyberspace. All 3 of these aspects are pretty good in their own regard, but there is a lot of improvement to be made. The first of these I'd like to discuss is the combat. Frontiers' combat it's kind of interesting. I don't think it's flat out bad. It does have some good aspects, like how flashy it is. It does keep in mind that Sonic's kind of whole thing is that he's a cool character, and that is definitely showed off in the Titan boss fights. There's a reason these were talked about for so long. It's because they finally made Sonic look like a legitimately cool character after so long. I love a lot of these meta-era games, like Generations and Colors, I think are some of the genuine best Sonic games. But man, they really didn't have that much going for them when it went to just making Sonic look cool. They did not do a good job of that. Now, obviously, a game being fun is more important than a game being cool, so I'm glad they prioritized that, but it is cool to see that Sonic's, flair is coming back here. But as I just said, gameplay is more important. That's kind of where this flops. Some of the later enemies do actually start to challenge you a little bit, but Frontiers' system is just kind of fundamentally flawed. It's almost impossible to make proper difficulty in this type of game. Because yeah, the rings sort of function like a health bar, but tell me, which is easier? You see a green bar at the bottom of your screen that tells you how much health you have? Or a number out of a number, like a fraction, that if it hits 0, then you die when you get hit? Because also keep in mind, your rings aren't actually your health. It's basically a shield, and if your shield's gone, then you die. You have to get hit after you hit 0 rings. It's just very unintuitive, and with Frontiers' just easily available rings, you can just farm these, it just doesn't really work. I can kind of understand what they were trying to do with the Psy loop and maybe make it where, you attack the enemy, and then if you can get away for a second, you can get a couple rings to get your health back, and then go back to attacking the enemy. If that was the idea, I see where you're coming from here, but the enemies don't really pose enough of a threat to do that, which is a pretty big issue. And like I've said before, I do not hate this combat system. It does work fairly well. I do think there are certain aspects of it that they do need to expand on. One of those is juggling enemies. Seriously, going to Ornos Island and then just Psy-looping soldier enemies and just juggling them in the air is stupidly fun. This is more fun than it has any reason to be. This is seriously really fun. It's crazy how the basic soldier enemies have the most depth out of any enemy in this game, because most all the other ones are about a main gimmick, which is very interesting. Frontiers' combat is still functioning it's more like a puzzle or a platforming section. Heck, I mean, that's literally what this entire mini-boss is about. There's a couple of them that are just straight up rails and platforms. So yeah, which I don't think is a bad direction, but I think the actual just enemy to Sonic combat needs a lot of work. I think the ring system While I think the rings could be used for other things, such as maybe a currency of some kind, and I think that, if you don't have any rings, you die, needs to be implemented in some sort, I do think there does need to just be some proper health bar of some kind. I know this is a bit of an outlandish idea, but I had just thought of, what if Sonic's rings actually did transfer into a health bar? The rings function as a health bar, but you get a much better indicator when you're in combat. Like if you go up to an enemy, if you're in this combat stance, which they did already program that in, if you're in combat or not. So if you're in combat, I think you could just have some sort of health or shield pop up where your rings are your shield. That actually would be the most informative way of doing it, to where you die in one hit, but your real health is just the shields protecting you from that one hit death. So I do agree, rings need to be implemented in some way, but I'm not totally sure how to do it. To be honest, it's pretty difficult to kind of come to a solution here, because rings are so iconic and central to Sonic. You collect rings, if you get hit, you lose your rings, and if you don't have any rings and you get hit, you die. That has been a fundamental of literally every single Sonic game. This is one of the core things about Sonic. So I'm not sure how to handle this, honestly. I'm not entirely sure what to do here. There's some different approaches, and you could just flat out scrap the rings being your health concept in combat, which wouldn't be a bad idea. I do think that would be more fun, but it's so central to what makes Sonic Sonic, it's kind of impossible to scrap it. So when it comes to Frontiers' combat, it is fun, but I think there needs to be a higher focus on more challenge, more proper player input, not just doing the most damage. Make all of the moves actually have more impact and do different things. And it's crazy that you only get to see some of the differences between the moves literally only on the soldier enemies. You don't know how long it took me to realize that these are actual combo finishers based on the direction of the control stick. If you're pressing up, you actually make the soldier enemy fly upward, you're kicking him upward. I never realized that, because this is the only enemy that actually lets you do this. That's the sad part. This combat system does actually have some decent depth, but the enemies, I think, are the biggest problem, really, because there are some good enemies. I like that there are enemies that are platforming focused, or are more about a gimmick, or some sort of idea like that. Force you to use the side loop. That's kind of a thing you could say about this whole game. When in doubt, use a side loop. But there needs to be a higher focus on how the enemies are designed. Sonic does need tweaking, the parry, obviously, you've heard all the criticisms before. There needs to be some fixes to Sonic, but I think the bigger issue to this game is the enemies. Man, the Final Horizon just kind of made the enemies just be on 200% speed, which is a little bit ridiculous, but there's a reason why this is the only time I ever really died in this game. It's a bit absurd. So seriously, with this game, doing a pretty solid job of making Sonic look cool, if we could just have the depth and the enemy design to back up what makes that cool, then I think we would have a really good combat system. And after playing some more action-focused games like the God of War series and touching on some of the Ninja Gaiden games with Ninja Gaiden 2 Black coming out recently, it really showed me that you can have all this flash, but all the depth behind it too, especially God of War 3. This game has some of the biggest set pieces and has a lot of things that I feel are basically just Titan fights. But this game has the depth, enemy design, and honestly just cooler cinematics to make it all come together. And so, while I don't expect a perfect combat system, and Frontiers isn't a game focused pretty much solely on the combat like, let's say, God of War, I do think it really shows the potential of how far a combat system could go. Next up is platforming and puzzle solving. So in Frontiers, a large part of the game, and mostly, honestly, kind of the majority of your time in this game sometimes, is just going through platforming sections and getting a memory token at the end. Now, this is a really fun formula. But these platforming sections, they don't fit into the environment. There is a lot of really restrictive 2D, which I don't mind 2D, but having that be in an open world really kind of defeats the point of an open, zone in its entirety. Why would I want an open zone to just lead me into a 2D section? It just kind of defeats the point of it. And so while I don't want to be one of those people where I just ramble on about rolling physics and all that, I do think that would be a thing to really help this formula, because it does complement the idea of Sonic using the terrain to platform instead of a lot of these, blocky platforms, basic wall running tile, and then just springs and dash panels. These are all fine in their own regard, but I think a physics-based approach would complement an open zone style a little better than what we have going on in Frontiers. So I'm glad that Kishimoto has clearly stated that he's pretty open to this and he's considered dropping the boost. While we don't know if they're gonna do that, I kinda hope they do. I'm not tired of the boost. I just think, like I just said, a more physics-based approach simply complements an open world better. It really does. I think in a linear level, I will always say I like the boost more. When it comes to getting from one place to another, I am a fan of the boost. I think that is by far the most fun linear Sonic gameplay style. With that said though, we're not in a linear level anymore. We're now in a big sandbox world, and that's where I think the rolling physics can be the most fun, because rolling down a hill in a big open world is way more fun than spin dashing off a building in a linear level. Don't get me wrong, I really love Sonic Adventure, and I think Adventure 2 is good, especially in its speed stages, but sometimes a more physics-based approach isn't perfect. And I think that in this open zone context, it would just be the most effective. One thing they definitely need to bring back is a proper parkour system. It's kind of weird that they've brought wall running back into the series, but didn't bring anything else with it. I think that's kind of odd. And to add on to why I think the physics-based approach would work is that, say, wall running would work really well with a physics system, because that would mean that, say, you have to be going a certain speed in order to maintain your wall run. I think that would be pretty fun, to where you don't just kind of stick to it like glue and then have to press the boost button to forcibly walk in whatever direction, and then it be really clunky and sometimes be too fast yet too slow, and you kind of can't control your direction properly. Also, these being like strict square tiles makes going diagonally really, really weird to do. Which is also weird because they could have just rotated them, like we see that in other sections. I don't know why they just didn't rotate them, whatever. And so with the platforming in a future open zone game, I think the best approach is to go a little bit more physics-based. Let's not go too far though with something like Sonic GT, which I think is just way too overboard. That is way too much physics approach. We should have, pretty normal controls with the physics just helping you go a little bit faster, just adding a little bit of an extra skill ceiling, just boosting the skill ceiling a little higher instead of the entire game being fundamentally centered around that. It should enhance the gameplay, not be the gameplay in its entirety. So with that said, we kind of got to flip to the other side of the open zone gameplay coin, which is the puzzles. And in all honesty, I don't have that much criticism of the puzzles. Most of them are pretty fun. Yeah, they could be a little more difficult, and there's a criticism I could give for this and the platforming, which is, combine it into the environment more. Make it feel like it's a part of the world, which is something that other games I think have done really well in their level design. So I would hope that in a future open zone game, it's not as much as like, hey, big question mark thing. Guys, we put a puzzle here that you've seen a couple times. Do it if you want to. It's more like a proper part of the world that makes each puzzle feel unique. That's kind of the problem, is that you see one of these and it's like, all right, well, I know it's another pattern puzzle to where I have to walk in the right direction. You already know exactly what you have to do. I think the best puzzles, it's like you slowly learn what kind of thing you're doing, but the environment puts different spins on it to where it can get progressively more difficult. And not just difficult in the way of like, hey, this is the exact same puzzle, but you're gonna have to think about it for 3 more seconds. It's like proper different. But I say that's really the biggest problem with the puzzles, is that the puzzles themselves are kind of whatever. I would want, obviously, like I said, more challenge to them, to just have more thought be put into them, but I kind of wish there was more variety, and I think basing them in the environment instead of just the same exact puzzle but with just some parameters changed would really make them more interesting. So the final part of Frontiers' formula that I want to discuss today is the cyberspace or linear levels in the game. Now, I think these are a genius addition. You can debate the quality of them, and I don't think they're especially amazing, but boy, the idea of having your new Sonic game that's a good bit different than most every Sonic game before it, but also then having your linear boost levels to kind of just tie everything together and not make it as completely different is a great decision. And I think these levels are a good addition because that linear Sonic level is like, it's still great format. It still works. So I'm glad they added these. And honestly, I could give a lot of criticism talking about, the steering, the control, the level design being taken, the environment themes just being Generations assets, the updates carrying the weight a little bit to improve them with quality of life. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to cyberspace. But really, I don't need to bring all that up, because if you want to do linear Sonic levels right, especially in the era we're in now, just Shadow Generations. Not really much else needs to be said. And heck, with me proposing a more physics-based approach, well, Shadow Generations, while definitely being a boost game, has more of the sort of adventure kind of like level design tendencies in it. So, if there is more of a physics-based approach, you really wouldn't have to tweak that much when it comes to the level design philosophy of Shadow Generations to make a fun experience. Or heck, in a physics-based approach, there is no reason to really say that the boost and momentum physics can't coexist. The idea of the boost giving you a good amount of speed, but if you use the rolling physics right, then you can go a little bit faster. It just makes it where the rolling is a little more advanced and is required for some segments, but the boost is a little more general. Although you're not going to get as much speed and you're not going to be able to access certain areas if you're not using the physics right. The boost is the safe option, but the rolling physics is kind of the risk and reward type of gameplay. So, if they did that Shadow Generations level design with some obvious tweaks to make physics more viable would be great. Like, that would be perfect, honestly. There's very little I would actually change. That's pretty much it. So with that said, those are the main aspects of Frontiers' gameplay formula and how I think they could be evolved on in a future open zone game. So, if a Frontiers sequel had combat that had much better enemy design, more in-depth sort of tech that you could pull off, and just interesting enemies that aren't just some random gimmick, and then you had open zone platforming and puzzles that had variety and were more based in their environment, and had some sort of risk and reward in it, and the linear levels were much better designed and featured lots of multiple pathways showcased perfectly in Shadow Generations, then I don't think it would be unreasonable to say we would have one of the greatest games of all time. I don't think that's a stretch to say. Now, do I think we're getting that? Of course not. I think that's unreasonable to think. I'm expecting a game that is at least an 8 out of 10, because I think Frontiers was good, but with this next game, they've already stated that this game has to be good, so I expect it to be. But with this video, I didn't really want to state what my predictions were for the next game. I just wanted to give what I think the real potential of the next open zone game could be. I'm not reaching or setting my hopes too high. I just kind of wanted to state that I think this formula has so much potential, and that I hope that this next game can be much better than Frontiers, and that the game after that can just be even better. I just want to see progress, and I'm expecting a big step with the next game. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I just need to see the large improvement on this game's glaring issues that have been pointed out by a ton of people. So while Frontiers is good, I'm just even more excited for the future. Frontiers kind of makes me more excited for the future of Sonic than, how much I actually like the game. The game is kind of more of a teaser of what's to come sometimes than a game that's just good. This game makes me incredibly excited for what's to come next. I hope it does for you too. So, with all of that said, I do hope all of you have an amazing rest of your day. God bless.